We're getting close to starting today. If you could find a seat that you like, and we'll try to get the folks out in the lobby to come in and join us. Yeah, I don't think so. Not now. Great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for showing up and attending, and hello to those people who are watching us on the live stream. My name is Chuck DeVore. I'm the Vice President of National Initiatives for the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We like to think of ourselves as America's largest state-based free market think tank. And of course, that shouldn't be a shock to anybody, right? It's Texas. Everything's bigger in Texas. So here we are. This panel is going to be, I think, a very fascinating panel. It's going to be about urban policy and a lot of different sub-elements of urban policy, of which, of course, homelessness is one important element. And so what I'd like to do before we kick off, or to kick us off, is to run down and let you know who's with us on stage today. To my immediate left, your right, is Alan Graham. And Alan Graham used to be, you were a developer here in Austin, weren't you? So yeah, well, you are, yes, as a matter of fact. That's a good way of putting it. You still do develop things, just different things. Yeah. So Alan is the founder and CEO of Mobile Loaves and Fishes and is the visionary behind our Community First village. He, as I mentioned, used to be a more traditional real estate developer. He founded Trilogy Development and the Links Group. He's published a book called Welcome Homeless, One Man's Journey of Discovering the Meaning of Home. Alan and his wife, Tricia, were married in 1984 and have 4 children and a niece that they've raised as well. Next to my left is Michelle Steeb. Now, Michelle, don't hold this against her. Michelle, like me, is a person who has fled the Golden State, although Michelle more recently than I. She, back in 2007, joined St. John's, which is a battered women's shelter in Sacramento, as the executive director, and now she works as a consultant to develop public and private partnerships. In 2012, Governor Jerry Brown appointed her to serve on the board of California's Prison Industry Authority. In 2019, she received the Community Service Award from the American Society for Public Administration. Prior to working at St. John's, though, and this is how I knew Michelle back in a previous life, she was the Vice President of Public Affairs for the California Chamber of Commerce back when I was a state lawmaker in California. So kind of odd how sometimes things come full circle. So I moved out to Texas 8 years ago, and you moved out with your husband and one of your 5 children, right? So your other 4 are still in college?
No, still in California.
Still in California,
yeah.
Okay. And so she lives now in Lucas, Texas. Further to my left is Michael Searle. He is formerly Chief of Staff of Austin City Council member Ellen Trox-Clare, who also does a lot of fine work here for the foundation. He works on a variety of capacities at the local, state, and national political level. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Austin Civic Fund, serves on the board of directors of Just Liberty and Austin Independent Business Alliance, and he's the associate director of the National Pardon Project, a collaboration of national organizations and political leaders that facilitate pardons and commutations of deserving federal prisoners. And then lastly, but not least, we have a former colleague of ours here at the foundation, Jeffrey Tawawa. And Jeffrey has been kind enough, of course, to kind of keep a family presence here in the foundation because his wife works for us, which is pretty fun. I won't say publicly whom I prefer. Jeffrey is the Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for the Real Estate Council of Austin. Prior to working with the Real Estate Council, he worked for the Home Builders Association of Greater Austin, representing them and leading advocacy efforts in over 30 municipalities in a 6-county area. He's also served as district director for State Representative Lyle Larson and consulted for a number of political campaigns in the San Antonio area as well as around Texas. He's a graduate of St. Mary's University and also serves on the board of the Hays County Emergency Services District Number 1, the Hays County Combined Emergency Communication Center, and the countywide EMS service. You're not in my district, but if you were, I would probably vote for you. So I think I'm in District 4 out in Hays County. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to kick things off a little unconventionally here. There's a short video that we'd like to show you from Alan Graham's Mobile Loaves and Fishes to kind of help set the stage of one of the key policy elements that we're going to be talking about today, which is the issue of homelessness, and in particular, how Alan's group has responded to that challenge. So if you could join me in watching this short video.
Village is the craziest place I've ever been and ever lived.
Oh!
I love this place. What we're doing here in Austin, Texas has never been done anywhere in the United States of America or the world. Mobile Loaves and Fishes has created a new movement designed to lift the most chronically homeless men and women of our community up off the streets. When I look back on it, it was nothing short of a miracle. The current system for addressing chronic homelessness in the United States of America is absolutely not working. This is a human issue that requires a human response.
Peanut butter and jelly or meat and cheese. You need a blanket, bro? Yeah. Let's grab us some food, man. Yeah.
Mobile Loaves and Fishes was started back in 1998 in order to feed the homeless in Austin, Texas. When the truck goes out, those that are serving and those that are being served are on the same side of the serving counter.
Oreos, cookie, water.
There's no disconnect. And this requires a human-to-human, heart-to-heart relationship.
Yeah, I know what it means. It's a simple thing.
And that singularly was the game changer.
Truly, that food truck ministry is what taught us what we needed to know in order to build Community First Village.
In 2004, I came up with this idea that we could go out and buy a gently used recreational vehicle, lift somebody up off the streets. And I started fantasizing as the serial entrepreneur that I am, why can't we build an RV park?
Community First Village is a 51-acre master-planned community that is designed to lift the chronically homeless up off the streets of Austin. Mobile Loaves and Fishes cares for the people who have experienced long-term homelessness. Many of them 5, 10, 15, even 20 plus years. At that point, they have experienced so much trauma.
We believe that the single greatest cause of homelessness, particularly in our country, is a profound, catastrophic loss of family.
I was married for 8 years. I got a divorce in '92. I lost my house and my world because I lost custody of my son, full custody. It devastated me, so I medicated myself with drugs. To tell you the truth, I really didn't want to live anymore. But coming to Community First, it's been one of the best things that's ever happened to me.
Our role is to really bring them into a community where they are loved and cared about and where they have an opportunity to begin the process of healing from all of that trauma.
At Mobile Loaves and Fishes, our only goal is to inspire communities into a lifestyle of service with the homeless. That's it.
The neighbors that live at Community First Village are incredibly gifted human beings. One of the joys of the work that we do is being able to give them the opportunity to put those gifts and talents to work.
We create micro-enterprise opportunities for our neighbors to earn a dignified income doing things that they love to do. We have a car care business, an art house, a pottery operation, a blacksmithing shop, a wood shop, in a full-blown organic farming operation.
Over the last 2 years, we've paid out more than $1 million to our neighbors. That's putting money back into their pockets to help them to be able to earn a living and enjoy life here. All of us desire to have purpose in our life. Community First Village is transforming the lives of everyone who's a part of this community.
This place, it's really empowered me to do great things. I have my own family here, a real family that pulled me up and loved me when I couldn't love myself. This is where I got my life back.
Housing will never solve homelessness, but community will.
So, had you tried to locate any facilities in the city limits previously?
Yeah, so when the idea entered my brain in 2004, and we lifted the one guy up in 2005, and I started fantasizing about developing this RV park, I put a proposal together and put it in front of the mayor of Austin, then Will Wynn, and said, Mayor, if you will provide us with a tract of land anywhere in the city of Austin, we don't care where it is. I have two requirements. One, it must have reasonable access to public transportation, and two, it must have the entitlements that we need, zoning, water, sewer, to do the development that we're talking about. And he got pumped about it. And in April of 2008, under the sponsorship of Councilmember Mike Martinez at the time, the City Council voted unanimously to grant us a long-term ground lease on 17 acres off of Ed Bluestein and MLK, kind of in that neighborhood. And then we unleashed all of our development team. We were probably $500,000 into this deal. And Mike and I went to a neighborhood meeting in the neighborhood that we were contiguous to that just imploded into our version of Armageddon. Literally, the police had to be called to escort us out of the place. And then we attempted several more tries, similar deal, although the neighborhoods meetings we would go to would then have police there already because these things turn into a very caustic environment.
So, Jeffrey, one of the things that strikes me about Alan's story regarding the getting the political permission to build in the city is how the existing property owners and voters are able to pressure elected members to essentially manipulate or to change the rules to kind of lock things in the way they want to do it. Do you find that as well for more traditional development, for example, high-rise luxury condominiums or apartment complexes or single-family dwellings? How's that looking in Austin? And then as a follow-on, do you think that affects the availability of housing and its price?
Sure. Yeah, the story of what initially happened with Alan and his group, it's a story of every development that happens in Austin. The difference is that, for us, either we're in a position where we can easily exit out and we have other options, or we, if we're stuck too far in, we can, maybe potentially find some way to make the finances work. For Alan and his operation, that means fewer people that he can help, and that's a huge impact. And I'm sure, even though he eventually was able to do really awesome things and continue to do really awesome things at Community First, I'm sure that $500,000 hit, didn't really sit well with you, and that meant a bunch of people that you potentially couldn't help. And the neighborhoods here, and we call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard, is what you typically hear. They are very aggressive, and it doesn't matter whether you're a single family home, you're building townhomes, or the high-rise development. They come out in droves, and that it's unfortunate that council listens to them so aggressively. And I think the harder thing is that the impact it has on ultimately the costs as well as the process. When a developer looks at a piece of property now in Austin, it's not just looking at the entitlements and things like that. It's also trying to figure out how much controversy am I going to attract and potentially, have to go through in order to get this project ultimately approved? There was a project a couple years back that they had to go through a pretty extensive zoning process, and even before they started the formal process, there was a 2-year-long process with the neighborhoods that they invested a considerable amount of money in, trying to find compromise even before they started the process. But when it became apparent that there was going to be no compromise available because they just didn't want anything to happen, the developer ultimately just moved forward, and it began the 1.5-year-long process. And you're talking millions and millions of dollars invested in this large 750-acre project that ultimately got passed down to the consumer in the form of the price increase on the homes.
Michael, you've touched a few cities around Texas and have probably an interesting point of view as to policy and the practical consequences of what that, how that really kind of plays out within the livability of cities. If you look at things like parking and roads and congestion and, give me kind of your take on where things are going, both from a livability standpoint and how any sort of nexus with politics or philosophy, because that's obviously driving some of this.
Yeah, so in order to understand where we're going, we got to understand where we came from. So to follow up on that previous question, before 2014, the Austin City Council was elected in May. Your turnout was citywide. The turnout was about 7 or 8% of the city. So the neighborhoods, the NIMBYs, could energize and turn their voters out to elect people who saw land development issues the same way they did. Well, when we moved to the 10-1 system and elections got moved to November, it's starting to dilute their power. Turnout's a lot higher. There's the same population, and council members are being elected that don't come from that political perspective. However, from a policy perspective, I have some concerns because what's filling that void has its own challenges to affordability and livability and the long-term success of our city. Because where you'll see people who might be more welcoming to development, they also have other political agendas that are being inserted into the development process that add to the cost of doing business in Austin. So while there's some good things that are happening with the elections now being in November and more people showing up, there's still some challenges that we face as a city.
So Michelle, before we get to potentially a question related specifically to your expertise in homeless policy as you've seen it in California, let me ask you, because you were connected with the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm sure you have some interesting opinions now that you've been in Texas for a little while. As bad as things are in Austin, at least from our perspective, I'm sure that to a large degree, everything that is about to happen here has probably already happened 10 years ago in some city in California. And so could you give us perhaps your thoughts as to what the future might look like here? I mean, where is all this going from the standpoint of what you've seen out on the West Coast?
Well, I hope not. I hope that not everything that I've seen in California happens here. Hopefully this discussion enlightens some of you to help prevent that. California is, I was talking to James a little bit earlier. He was asking if I felt like things were going to hit a rock bottom and that we were going to start to turn things around. And I said, unfortunately, I don't feel that way. I look at the way our districts are drawn. I look at the way who's leaving California. I look at the way we're governed. There's no balance in California anymore. And it's really hard to see how we climb out of that. There are some people who are much smarter about these, historical trends who think that we will, but I really hope that this governor here in Texas getting involved in the problems of homelessness here in in Austin and other things helps you not see what we've seen in California, because homelessness is, in addition to many other crises we face, fires, as you're watching on the news, homelessness is at crisis, very severe crisis levels with no end in sight.
So this is for Michael and Alan. I'd like to ask, I think there you go. If you look at the city of Austin, and I guess we're beginning to see this in other cities in Texas as well, you're seeing this drive to regulate more on things that, frankly, I sometimes wonder why is it that they're doing this. And let me give you a couple of examples to comment on. One, a couple of years ago, I noticed that in Austin, they were requiring a license to haul any sort of stuff out of someone's backyard. Like if there was a windstorm and there was a lot of branches down in the backyard, or maybe some old rusty appliance that is breeding mosquitoes, and it's too heavy for the resident to put into a pickup truck. So the city requires a license. They require an inspection of the truck. They require, I think, $1 million or $500,000 worth of liability insurance. And if you don't have any of that, you get a fine, and if you don't pay the fine, of course, you face jail time, right? That's one example. Another example to Alan will be the issue of occupational licensing and kind of its extended cousins. For example, whether or not people are allowed to do street vending and how that works. So, Michael, where is this coming from? For example, like the paid sick leave ordinance, that's another interesting example that is putting small business under pressure. Why is this going on? What's the impetus?
I mean, the short answer is you have no diversity of ideas on the council anymore, which creates, you have a fully liberal council who's become an echo chamber of ideas, and they're like, and you have two problems. You have a political one, which is the one I'm highlighting, which is you need counter voices on the council to push back on some of these things. The second issue you have is a bureaucratic one, in which the city council, the city council is the board of directors of the city. The mayor is not the CEO. The city manager is the CEO, so he's in charge of operations of the city, and they have empowered bureaucrats who have a natural incentive to keep their jobs and be relevant. And part of doing that is creating rules that they will enforce, and there's been no check on that. And those rules are always added. Rules in the city of Austin are never removed, except for the famous one when Ellen made it okay for kids to put up lemonade stands without having to get a permit from the city. And until you have some people pushing back at City Hall, that trend is just going to continue.
Alan, how does that affect the homeless community in the greater Austin area?
Well, if you go back to, for those that can, June of 1976, which was when I moved to Austin, Texas, there were no panhandlers anywhere on our street corners, except for the occasional stereotypical person that might have been downtown. What you had on our street corners were men and women that were selling bottles of water, newspapers, flowers, cow skulls, cow skins, and your favorite, Velvet Elvis art. All of that has essentially been either outlawed, or the licensing requirements are so onerous that the only remaining bastion of entrepreneurialism left to people that live in extreme poverty, like our homeless friends, is the First Amendment free speech right to stand there with a sign and beg you for money. So if you and I get on an airplane right now and travel to any third world country, most countries anywhere outside of third world countries, and you get off the airplane, you will be assaulted by a gauntlet of entrepreneurs selling everything. You come to the United States of America, and guess what happens? We're being assaulted by a gauntlet of beggars in the most abundant country in the history of the world. Everybody that's standing on that street corner is not standing there because they're lazy. They want to work. And if we give them the opportunity, say, to me, it should be a First Amendment free speech right now
to go to Sam's Club and buy a box of Blow Pops, a prepackaged food item that's certified in a factory somewhere, and sell that in the public spaces and earn a dignified income. But instead, we want people to beg, and that's a policy issue, and that's not a choice issue by the men and women that are out there. We give them the choice, and I predict 80% of them would start selling waters or flowers or whatever. But it's the nanny state and the NIMBY state that we live in that is creating this cacophony.
Michelle, oh, sure, please.
You know, I have a really great, simple example that I think might detail the complexities of at least the development process here in Austin. I'll need Michael's assistance here for just a second.
It's still going.
Well, that's what happens. You fall off the cliff.
So real quick, this is a chart that me and another an actual city employee, we assembled, and it's a list of every department and every employee that is involved in the development process. And so it spans 13 departments and 492 employees. And so when we talk about the complexity in the licensing and regulation, this is just the development process of if you want to build something. And so when you talk to, getting a permit to, sell things, stuff like that, you have to go through the same kind of mess. It may not be 13 departments, but it's going to be a number of different departments, and that adds cost. So.
I want one of those.
It's large enough you could probably start to build a house out of it there. So, Michelle, let's talk for a moment about unintended consequences, which often happen with government actions. In particular, I'd like to hear your take on a policy that's known as Housing First. My understanding is that there's been kind of a movement, and what I thought was fascinating about Alan's short video for Mobile Loaves and Fishes is that the emphasis on how people became homeless was on kind of the shattering of family, right? As opposed to, oh, they're homeless because they don't have a home, right? So what is the Housing First policy? What's the genesis of that? And what was the practical consequence of that policy that I understand was enacted in the Obama administration by the Department of Housing and Urban Development? What was the practical consequence for you as you were the CEO of a battered women's shelter in Sacramento, California?
So the Housing First policy, which is the only policy supported by HUD, which is, as many of you know, the largest funder and policy driver of homelessness. This policy was actually developed under George W. Bush's administration for the very, very severely chronically homeless. And I do this because it was a very small segment then of the homeless population. Under the Obama administration, people decided if it worked for that segment, which the research around whether or not it worked was light at best, but they decided if it worked for this population, then it's going to work for everyone. And in 2011, 2012, 2013, it began to be rolled out to the entire United States. So the policy is that everyone who becomes homeless gets a house. They get a house for life. They don't need to be sober. They don't need to be accountable. In fact, if you are the housing provider as the nonprofit and you require any sort of work training or you require counseling or you require sobriety, you are not eligible for public funding. Not only is this federal policy, but HUD encouraged all the states and the counties who, through which they often distribute their funds, to follow this policy as well. So in California in 2016, we adopted Housing First. Our county soon followed, Sacramento County. And because of the program that I run, which is all about, and it's very similar philosophically to Alan's program, and I'm very excited to go out and see it. But the program that I run for women and children struggling with homelessness, struggling with addiction, struggling with domestic violence, struggling with criminal history, we lost $1 million of funding with less than a month's notice because we require sobriety and because we require work training. Nothing about outcomes. Our outcomes are fantastic, but it was all about those two things. And programs like ours across the country have lost funding, many of which have shut their doors because they didn't have a very diversified funding base. We were fortunate that we had begun diversifying our funding base 11 years earlier, and we were able to survive that storm. But it was a big storm, and it was a big hit. And we have been trying to get this policy changed. Unfortunately, as Alan pointed out, this is not about housing, but a lot of people have bought into the fact that, you know, if the problem is homelessness, the solution is a house. It couldn't be further from the truth. The LA Times just did a very in-depth look at the LA population of homelessness. I hope every news organization in the country follows suit on this, because what they found is, what we were hearing from the homelessness authorities is that only about 25% of the people that are homeless were struggling with addiction, only about 30% mental illness. What the LA Times found out is 75% are struggling with addiction and mental illness, upwards of 75 to 80%. So this whole notion that the house is going to fix it is now dispelled. I mean, how many of us would love to hear a doctor, if we're dealing with addiction or we're dealing with mental illness, how many of us would be excited to hear from a doctor, oh, I got the solution for you, it's a house? It's ridiculous, right? So it has huge, huge ramifications at the local level, because homelessness is almost always dealt with at the local level, but it starts at the national level, and that's where we got to get that policy changed.
So, please, Alan, you want to weigh in?
Well, there's not a business on the planet that would sink everything that they do into one thing. And the failure of this is not so much what Housing First is, it's that that's the only thing. And they don't allow any innovation whatsoever, like a Community First Village, which is phenomenally successful. This week, we had the Secretary of HUD, Ben Carson, out at our village. His jaw was completely on the floor. He completely understands that model does not work. He's completely on board. But how do you turn that aircraft carrier around of a embedded institution that doesn't want to move off of that? And then the trough of the homeless industrial complex is firmly embedded in HUD. And how do you get off of that, out of that trough?
So back over to Jeffrey and Michael, let's look at cities for a moment, just as a phenomena, right? So urban areas, we've had them since the advent of agriculture, right? The agricultural revolution thousands of years ago, because they're efficient, right? People come together, they can sell their services that are more specialized. And so we keep getting cities that are bigger and produce more economic value. You have increased density, which itself is a challenge from costs and from the construction. So give me, kind of your vision as to where this is going. In other words, we're seeing across America, cities are becoming more and more of a political monoculture, right? And as a result, there may be certain things that they're doing that just might not be supported by evidence or common sense. So I know, for example, in the case of California, some estimates are that housing costs 40 to 60% more because of things like restrictive zoning and environmental laws and regulations and constant lawsuits. Texas seems to be catching up with that in a bad way. Where does this go? I mean, how sustainable is this trajectory?
You want to take it first? Okay. I mean, I would say we know where it goes. We only have to look to other cities who have adopted these kinds of trajectories to get an example of where this goes. Just as the homeless example, I can't remember the article, but there was an article from San Francisco, and they said, new homeless policy, we're going to repeal camping ordinances. We're going to build 1,000 housing first units. We're going to do a $500 million affordable housing bond. We're going to increase density in the urban core to allow for more affordable housing. And we're going to spend $300 million a year to house people and provide homeless services. Does that sound familiar? I mean, that's exactly what Austin is proposing to do. 2 years after that proposal, homelessness increased by 17% in San Francisco. Outcomes don't matter. I mean, if you look at, and I'm glad you used the word homeless industrial complex, because I was going to use it, but it's a sensitive word. People are trying to do good work. City council members, even them, some of them are well-intentioned, but the Echo's plan doesn't have the appropriate metrics to make sure that when we're spending money, we're having success towards whatever goal we're trying to achieve. And this whole thing with the repealing the ordinance and city council, they would do themselves a lot of goodwill if they just said, y'all, we don't know what to do. We repealed the ordinance and it created a problem and we messed up and we don't know what to do. But you know what? Alan Graham knows what to do. Let's go talk to him and figure out a plan. Business community, put your money behind this guy. If they just had the humility to do that, we could start off on the right track, but I don't think they're going to.
Yeah, I think I would echo some of those sentiments in that, if you really look at San Francisco, even, 10, 15 years ago, that is exactly the trajectory we're going, especially as far as regulatory stuff, goes. One of the biggest struggles we've had here in Austin is, with the diversity of our economy and all the jobs that are coming here. I mean, the last recession, we weathered it the best out of a lot of other cities, even here in Texas, and that was because of the diversity of our economy. So people want to live here and they want to move here, but as those people are coming, there's a question of where do they go and where do we put them, and Austin for so long has put such a constraint on the market. We even had one council member say that they don't believe in supply and demand, but he had such a constraint on the market that you're seeing this issue of housing affordability, and so people are then having to go to the outskirts to find that housing that is more affordable to them, and it's only compounded when you talk about people who are in the lowest medium family income of, maybe they were the ones who were then forced out of Pflugerville and now they're having to live out in Lockhart, and now even that's getting more unaffordable. And so, I really think that, to Michael Searle's point, I think it's, getting out of the way and letting, the private sector figure out, what the best way to do it, finding things that work and actually investing in them. Alan's program is such a great example of he literally said, I'm going to build it outside the city since you don't want to do it, and I'm just going to make it work, and it's worked. And a smart thing to do would be to say, here's a program that's worked. Let's invest time and money. Let's make it easier for Alan to get his permits, so he can get these people the help that they need. But that's not the approach that these bureaucracies are used to doing. And so part of what a lot of us try to do is to push that barrier on council, trying to get them to realize some of the issues that they're having. A big quick example, here in Austin, they're say they're very environmentally sensitive, to a lot of those concerns and things like that. And what they've essentially done is they've essentially drawn a line down the middle of the city and said, on the west side of Austin, you're not allowed to build, anything smaller than, 8,000 square foot lot. And so you end up with these giant homes on these very large lots because that's more environmentally sensitive. And so what that does is that pushes the more dense options to the east side of town, people who are already struggling, to live in their homes because of rising property tax and stuff like that. And all of a sudden the density is being forced, out that direction as opposed to being spread out through the city, and more importantly being, focused as a market-driven approach where the market's allowed to make things work. And that's not to say we shouldn't have detention ponds and things like that, because flooding's a big concern, but there has to be a way where everything works.
So let me just throw out an example and ask perhaps Michael or Jeffrey to comment on this. I saw recently where there was a plan floated that would convert Congress Avenue into a pedestrian thoroughfare, right? Take all the cars off of Congress. And I've been reading as well, pretty constantly, and you see it around town, where the city council keeps reducing the amount of parking on the street. What's the goal of this policy? I mean, are they really trying to shrink the number of parking spots in toto, or are there things that we're just not seeing? For example, like maybe a high-rise parking facility that is going in and creating additional parking spaces. What's the end goal of that? What are they envisioning, do you think, with these policies?
I mean, they don't really hide that. I mean, the high-level stated goal of the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan, which is the city's transportation plan, is to reduce single occupancy vehicles from where it is now, around 75% to 50%. They want people out of their cars for whatever their purpose, their goal is. I mean, they say it's for environmental reasons, but I don't know that the evidence supports that switching from cars to transit is effective, not to mention we're going into a technological revolution in how we get around, and electric vehicles autonomous vehicles could very well be all electric and better for the environment. But anyways, their stated goal is to get people out of their cars and into public transit. And all these changes they're making are driven by that overarching goal. I mean, reducing parking on the street, closing down Congress Avenue, putting in dedicated lanes, which they'll be doing in 2020. All of this is to repeat the mistakes made in Seattle and San Francisco, who have right now the 6th and 4th worst traffic in the country, to repeat the mistakes made there.
Well, that's optimistic.
The one, couple things I'll add. When we talk about density and being able to place it along the right areas, the whole idea a lot of it with transit is there's a certain point in time where you achieve the right amount of density along these corridors to move people. And I learned an interesting statistic about parking. So in downtown Austin today, there is enough parking for every person to have at least 2 spots. The problem is that we're not managing it correctly, in that when you go into one parking garage, there's probably 4 or 5 empty spots for every person, but then the other one, you're doing the loop-de-loop like you usually do here in the Austin Club every time I come here. That happens to me. I'm sure it happens to some of you. But I think we need to figure out a way of how we manage this parking better. Should we shut down Congress Avenue and turn it into a giant pedestrian bridge? I have no idea. But if we figure out how to move people as a region better, that involves public transit, that might be something we're thinking about. We may not choose to use public transit, but think about the people who are potentially working at the airport. They may want to use public transit because it's easier than parking and fighting parking there at the airport, where it is a struggle to have parking. And then for people like at Community First Village, being able to get to their job, that might be a much more easier thing for them to do using public transit. But part of what we have to figure out is how do we move people. And in Austin, again, going back to their anti-growth mentality, they've said we're not going to do anything. And so as a result, they didn't plan for the right amount of right-of-way in their streets. And so they're having to take away lanes in order to make all of it work. And so it is a little bit of cart before the horse. But I think that a lot of us, both on the private sector and the public sector, are trying to find ways to make it work. Now, the irony is that Cap Metro is led by Randy Clark, who's really awesome and knowledgeable transit person, and we're trying to help him out too with understanding some of the density, and we're both together fighting the city to try to understand how to make it work. And so it is an interesting thing.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
There's got to be a little bit of disagreement up here. So Randy Clark is a really nice guy, but he comes from Boston. And if anybody's been to Boston and stuck in the traffic there, they were rated in a global study, the INRIC study, which is done every year, as the worst traffic in the country, despite all their investment in transit. And there's this theory that goes unchallenged about transit, that if people will get out of their cars and get into transit, and 2, it'll improve the road for the rest of us. But if you look at the data, there was according to the Census Bureau, since 2005, so 13 years of investment or 14 years of investment, how many billions of dollars have been made nationwide into transit and alternative modes of transportation? The usage of single occupancy vehicles has decreased 0.2% in 14 years and billions spent nationwide. So this theory that people will get out of their cars, I don't mean to be so confrontational, but that will go out of their cars, it's just not supported by data, and the city is wrongfully pursuing this same thing that's been done elsewhere without being backed by data.
What's interesting about that 0.2% reduction is I bet you the reason for the reduction isn't what the advocates say it is, which, well, it's that studies also show that the greater the internet use is in a country, the later and later and later children bother to get their driver's license. And so what they end up doing, of course, is going everywhere with their parents or their friends, or maybe public transportation. But it's not like it was when I was a kid in the mid 70s, where you couldn't wait to get your driver's license and start practicing driving it at 15 and a half and terrify your parents. But rather, my own children didn't start driving until like 19 or 20. And that's actually pretty common now. And it wouldn't shock me if that statistic is probably being driven more by that than by billions being invested. So it's time now for you to participate in this discussion. And what I'd like to do is to begin to have a microphone go around. And what I would appreciate is two things. Number one, tell us who you are, and if you're with somebody, let us know that. And then ask a question. Try to resist with all of your might the temptation to engage in a speech, because that's what we're up here for. So anyway, if we could, right over here, and please wait for the microphone. Yes.
Hello, Josh Klein. I'm a small business owner. Alan, I'm wondering how you foster a sense of ownership in your community instead of creating an entitlement, giving them a sense of ownership of their space.
Well, we have 3 simple rules to live in the community that turns out to be the same rules that you live by. Rule number 1, above all other rules, is you must pay rent. You don't pay rent, you're not going to live in our community. I got a report at our board meeting the other day that so far, up through September, we have collected $700,000 in rent this year and have written off $2,700. Your jaw should be dropping. Everybody go, oh, wow. I mean, there's no apartment complex on the planet that could do that, okay? And so when you have skin in the game, you're invested in your community. You come to our community, there's no trash on the ground, there's no cigarette butts, there's no urine, there's no feces. Rule number 2 is you must obey civil law. I don't make civil law. I don't enforce civil law. But let me tell you, man, we're a law-abiding place, and people respect that. Doesn't mean we don't have our issues. We got plenty of knucklehead behavior. You have it here at TPPF. So,
I've been meaning to talk with some of my colleagues about that, actually.
Yeah,
thank you.
The rumor's out there, Chuck. And then the third rule is that you live in a community that just has community rules about things to do. And then people work within the community. Those who are severely disabled are being helped by other people, but we have people in wheelchairs going into the blacksmithing shop and blacksmithing because they want to be purposeful. It's not complicated.
Okay, just behind this individual, we had another person, and then we're going to come up front here. Thank you. And we'll get over here.
My name is Alan Moore. I'm a retired doctor. And you all addressed the importance of mental health and drug addiction and the cause of homelessness. And these people definitely need help in being treated. How do you provide treatment for them in your particular situations? And then in the city of Austin, for example, as they're trying to address it through ARCH and whatnot, are they providing help to help treat the mental illness and the drug addiction?
It's impossible to treat mental illness on the streets. I'll tell you that right now. It's just, it's a virtual impossibility. In the village, we have 10 full-time employees that are connected with Integral Care, that are all behavioral health specialists. And every staff member at Mobile Loaves and Fishes is required to be mental health first aid trained. When you have that level of resource, mental health is relatively easy to manage. When you pour dope and alcohol on top of mental health issues, it becomes a very difficult situation. I will tell you that when you move from the streets into the village, there's an 80% drop in drug use and a 60% drop in alcohol use. It's almost impossible to get to full recovery.
So similar again to Alan's program, we have a residential campus. We provide all the drug and alcohol counseling, the mental health counseling on site by, people with their masters and PhDs. I would say one of the things they don't talk about in California, but nationwide, is there are not enough people coming out of the universities and colleges to actually provide the drug and alcohol and the mental health services. It's a big problem. So, in Housing First, initially they said, well, we'll get the drug and alcohol services to all the people in their houses. Well, first of all, there aren't, again, the employee base. There isn't the employee base to do that. But secondly, nonprofits really don't typically have the expertise to manage a distributed workforce. And that's what that requires. And it's very, Oracle spends billions of dollars a year to try and figure out how to manage a distributed workforce, as do other technology companies, because their employee base is increasingly distributed. Nonprofits don't have those kinds of, that kind of expertise, nor do they have those kinds of resources. So it's really, really a problem if you can't centralize where the people are actually living to deliver those services and to hold them accountable for accepting those services.
And we'll go over here next.
Thanks. First, a kidding comment. In Chicago, they solved this problem. You just bribe the alderman, he'll take care of your problem, then he goes to prison and you bribe the next one. 44 of their 50 aldermen have gone to prison in the last few years. So, but that does solve the problem. But now for a serious comment, it's worthwhile, sometimes in other states have tried this, municipal governments tend to draw more than their fair share of knuckleheads, to quote Alan. Sometimes you have to go beyond it with a successful program, go to a legislative level, like Governor Abbott, who's attempting to intervene a little bit here in the problem, and see if you can get a model program and get the legislature to override some of the municipal governments. Because as Michael was saying, you're not going to get municipal governments to show any brains. So you've got to try something different. And I got to tell you, state legislators in some states have a few people who are not knuckleheads.
Michael, did you want to take that?
No, I agree. I mean, you have to. We have limited options to address things, especially on a legislative level. So there are state solutions and there are local solutions. If the local solution is not being pursued, then you don't really have an option but to seek state help.
Yeah, Roger, you're from Chicago?
Well, suburbs, please.
Suburbs, okay. Well, I grew up in Schaumburg, right? And I remember Cabrini Green. Okay, so anyone here remember Cabrini Green? That was the Housing First model. That's essentially what Housing First is. They took a lot of people who did not have the resources to afford housing and to live different kinds of lives, and Cabrini Green in 10 years had the largest murder capital per rate. It's now gone. This was back in the 60s and 70s. But Housing First is essentially a dusted off version of Cabrini Green, and it's just scary to see it happening again.
All right, over here. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Housley. I work with the Texas Homeschool Coalition. My question, I think, was mainly for Alan. I know one of you said that homelessness would be likely the most dealt with on the local level. So, Alan, my question to you, and maybe applicable to Austin residents here in the room, what would be the best way that we who are not homeless could help serve you and the population that you serve over in your community, and just in general to help alleviate this kind of citywide problem and honestly a national problem?
Well, our vision statement at Mobile Loaves and Fishes, the thing that drives our organizations, is that we empower communities into a lifestyle of service with the homeless. So we don't feed people, we don't house people, we don't employ people. We just leverage those tools as conduits to connect human to human, heart to heart. Because at the end of the day, this is a human issue. I can promise you that the mayor, the city council, or the governor, or the president, or the director, the HUD secretary is not coming into our bedroom tonight to tuck us into bed and tell us how much they love us. But when we developed intimate relationships with people, and dive in deeply into their trauma and their vulnerabilities. If you want to talk about what Michelle was doing in Sacramento and the sexual abuse, it requires a human response, not a transactional response. Most of what we're talking about here was transactional. Housing First is extraordinarily transactional, whereas you have to live with the men and women. So what I would say is, we raise all of our money privately. We don't get any government funding. I mean, there's some help in some things. Yeah, amen. And but it's a matter of everybody getting involved in the city that wants to see a difference happening in our city, and that's that goes back to this issue of innovation. I say let people start throwing mud on the wall. Some of it's going to slide to the bottom, but some of it is going to stick. There's so many different opportunities in the way that we as a city can stand up, but the best way is to tell it. Look, government should only play a subsidiary role to you and I in mitigating this issue. They should not be the tip of the spear, but we as a culture have made government the tip of the spear. We have to retake and own that deal. They have value, right? Roads, water, sewer. There's lots of things that they can do very well. Fire, EMS, police, thank God. But let the humans deal with the humans. But we have to own it.
So I think the headline there that I can envision is TPPF panelist calls Austin city staff inhuman. Is that yeah, I could envision.
No, I'm not. Don't throw me into the octagon, bro.
Yeah, I could envision that. Yes. Yeah, okay, all right.
Hello, my name is Adriana Aldin. My question is either Michael or Jeffrey. I wrote an article in Texas Insider a few weeks ago about the homeless problem, since I am a resident of beautiful downtown Austin in a beautiful view until this situation happened. I'm going to have the opportunity to have a meeting this coming week with our city manager, Spencer Cronk. I'm bringing Matt Macabiak to come with me. If I could say something from you, what would you advise me to tell Spencer? Which, by the way, I have the pleasure to know Spencer on a more personal level, and I think he will be very open to listen to what I'm going to say.
So the first thing I'll say is, I think it's great that you're meeting with Spencer. We stole him away from Minneapolis, and at least as far as the development stuff goes, he's been, really great and open about being innovative and finding solutions. I think the challenge is that, especially when we talk about governmental system, is ultimately the city manager and the city staff have to do whatever city council says. That they do, and they set the policy. And so, I would almost start the conversation with, how can I help you do your job and be innovative and to find actual solutions, which I think is ultimately going to require you to then go to your council member, which is probably Kathy Tovo here in downtown Austin, and maybe even other council members, and really trying to talk to them about trying to find that innovative solution. That's where you're ultimately going to get it, because unfortunately, especially in this instance, city staff is pretty much handcuffed without any kind of council direction.
And oftentimes conflicting council direction. I'd ask him, what do you think about an audit now? No, there was a resolution that they passed when they changed when they did whatever they did to the ordinance, and there were components, there was direction and components of a comprehensive plan to address homelessness that I think are good. And I would want to know, one of the components is they need a plan for shelters. So I would want to know what his process is process timeline and budget is for developing that plan, and does he plan to include Alan Graham in those conversations?
I think I would just add one thing. What's his definition of success? Is the definition of success getting someone in a house for life where you're keeping them at the same level that they were at when they got put into that housing? Or is the definition of success what Alan's program is building, right? If the definition of success is helping people become productive members of the community, it's very clear where he needs to focus his efforts.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Dade. I'm a rabbi up in Georgetown and also a mayoral candidate up there. I have a question about leveraging the churches and the synagogues in some of these things. For example, in Georgetown, we have a church who has a shower program for homeless people, and they already have an existing building and existing resources. So what would be the thoughts or the obstacles to maybe even shifting city ordinances or city funds to enable some of those things that are already set up? A lot of the churches up in Georgetown have food banks, so instead of, like, let's say, building a separate warehouse, leveraging what we have, I know that might be a little bit dicey when you're talking about the church and state concept, which is misunderstood, but what are your thoughts on leveraging those types of programs?
We believe that at the banquet table of inclusion that we all desire here, everyone has to ask the question, who or whom do we exclude from that banquet table of inclusion to hit the inclusive state? And the liberal secularists, when I make that pronouncement, cock their head. And I go, I know, marinate on that. And we have to tell government that there is a role at the table, and a big role, because we do not live in a secular country. We live in a plural country, and we should welcome everyone at that banquet table. So if it's the banquet table of homelessness, the Christian, the Jew, the Muslim, the Zoroastrian, the atheist, whoever wants to be at that table ought to come to that table so that we can put our brain power. But probably one of the top 5 questions I get is about my faith. And how do we get into a culture, a plural culture, that wants to ask me whether my faith is an impediment or your faith would be an impediment in doing your work, when the reality is that our faith is a driver to the work that we do, and that's why we make. And so I think we have to stop this. Look, the government shouldn't be Christian, the government shouldn't be Jewish, the government shouldn't be Muslim. The Constitution is a plural constitution, but we should welcome everybody to that banquet table. That's kind of how I try to answer that question.
I would just say the church community is very active in St. John's, the program that I ran up until a couple months ago, and they're very active in the homelessness problem, but they're active more on the temporary solution versus the long term. And the long term is really what we all need to galvanize around, get around the banquet table to figure out. And again, it really starts with what's our definition of success. I think his definition of success is where we should all be focused.
Roger Borgelt, attorney. So, question for Michael. So you commented earlier about the changes in council over the years and how, since we went to the district system, we have somewhat less NIMBYism, I guess, going on with some of the newer council members. I'm paraphrasing what you said, but I think that's basically what you said. But we also, over the course of going to that system, have lost what few conservative voices we had and are kind of now back to a liberal echo chamber. And so how did that happen, and how can we fix it? And was that just purely demographics changing, or is there something else going on there?
I think it's 2 things. I think it's demographics, but it's Trump. I mean, the turnout in Travis County for Democrats shot through the roof with Trump on the ballot. It's no surprise we lost Sherry Gallo and Don Zimmerman when Trump was on the ballot, and then in this last election, when there was a conservative running for District 8, the turnout was similar. Democrats turned out in a little bit higher numbers, but the crossover vote that Ellen won as a fiscal conservative but young woman, Frank didn't get, because the dividing line and the division is so strong. And I think that'll, we'll get through another presidential election, and that will normalize, and there will be an opportunity for conservatives again to sit on the city council. But for now, it's probably not going to happen. For now. with Trump on the ballot. I mean, whatever you think about Trump, good or bad, indifferent, I mean, that's the reality of the turnout in Travis County. I mean, they hang Trump around everything they don't like at City Hall, and it works.
Any more questions? Yes, way over here. We'll make our microphone carrier work for a living right now. Thank you.
My name is Paul Butelman, and I'm just been living in Austin now 40 years, and or 35 years, and I've definitely seen a lot of changes. But one question, Mike, I want to bring up to you. There is a group out there, I forgot what they were called, talking for a recall of Adler and 5 of the city council. How do you think that's going to go? Do you think that's going to come up? And one other thing, Michelle, you didn't mention is your California government out there, state government, is about as liberal as they come anywhere in the country. I don't see how you can make any changes at the state level when the state and the local are so liberal that they're going to be opposed to anything, especially with private sector initiatives, with such a liberal group from top to bottom. So anyway, I don't know if you want to address that or not, but that's some of your problems, I think, out there in California. Like I was just reading an article here on the forest fires they're having, or the fires they're having out there. They're moving in all those wilderness areas to build rather than try to increase density in the big cities, and you've got plenty of them there. So comment, I guess, is just, the political side. How are the conservatives going to get back into power with, so much control that they have in a lot of these sectors of the country?
Well, I did say in my opening remarks that California is so unbalanced, right? We've lost all of our checks and balances, and I'm not sure how we get back to a healthy middle. Pray we do. Pray the state does. I'm no longer a we for me, but pray the state does. But I don't see how we do it at this point. It's lost all rationality.
And to respond to your question about recall, I mean, just who I am, in theory, I love the idea. I mean, but in practice, it's such a heavy lift. It's so much resources, and the risk is high, and we're up here talking about being focused on outcomes. What does it achieve? It creates a void that people that think the exact same way come in and fill. We would be a lot better served if we spent that treasure, time, effort into putting support towards Alan Graham or other organizations that are providing solutions to problems than kicking and screaming and trying to recall the mayor and council. And like I said, I love it in theory, but it's so risky, so expensive, and such a heavy lift. It's not going to be successful.
You brought are you going to comment on that?
Well, you were looking at me like you were desperate for me to comment on that.
You put the microphone to your lips.
Yeah, but I was. You were staring at me there, Chuck. I didn't.
I do that to people.
No, hell no, I'm not going to comment on that.
Best moments of panels. All right. Question down here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Susan Bright. I'm retired, but I spent my life in education. And I know that we have a lot going on for adults, and I know we have a lot going on for children. I know Terry Cole has street youth ministry, but is there anything in Austin that's specifically addressing the needs of children who are traumatized by all of this, and any kind of hope to break some generational patterns that develop when your family is homeless? Or you're couch surfing neighbors? Is anybody looking at what happens to those kids?
Well, it's all of this goes back to the profound catastrophic loss of family. So the trauma that is fueling the people that we serve, and that's fueling the foster care system, and fueling these at-risk families. Is this breakdown of the family structure, in our humble opinion. So I think if you really want to go upstream and begin to deal with that, and the multifaceted prism of this profound catastrophic loss of family has so many different issues that flow into those prisms and then get refracted into how you view that issue and how this person views that issue, and that it's extraordinarily complicated. And but until we begin to recognize that it's not mental health issues, because everybody in here's got somebody in their family that battles that deal. It's not a drug addiction deal. We all have addicts for the most part. We all have dysfunctional family members that we manage to come up underneath. But if you look at the issue of homelessness, chronic homelessness in Austin, Texas, it represents 0.06% and maybe 0.5% on a national level. It's a very small population of people that don't have even the slightest family net that comes up underneath them. And City Hall can't do that. And so until we begin to evangelize, in my humble opinion, this issue around the family and coming up underneath and valuing the family, we're in for a haul here in the United States. That's what I think.
Can I add to that, Chuck? Thank you for bringing that up. So we actually use an ACEs continuum. Are you familiar with ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experience score? And if you have a level 3 in your background, you're really at great risk of alcoholism, suicide, right? It's anyway, most of our children and women are anywhere between 4 and 6, and some are as high as 9. And it is really, really important while we have them in residence to not only address this trauma, but it is so necessary to turn off the spigot. I mentioned earlier that the national policy started changing, in 2011. Who are all these street homeless? I would argue a lot of them are children who became adults whose trauma was never addressed. And if we don't address childhood trauma when we have children in our care, that spigot is going to become even greater.
That's a guarantee.
Yeah.
That our population is exactly
the
level of trauma. I can tell you right now that you could go into our community right now and ask virtually every woman that lives in our community, how many times have you been sexually assaulted? Mm-hmm. And they cannot answer the question. Yeah. They don't know the answer. Yep. That's the level, and it goes back to when they're 5 years old. It's the let me tell you, man. Yeah. I tell you, every little girl's first love should be their daddy, and I've got my daughter right here, Taylor Graham, and I continue to be her first love, and I mirror what it is that's how it should be. But we have this trauma going on in this country. I don't know, man. Unbelievable.
So in our schedule, we had a plan for me to wrap up with a few minutes of brilliant remarks. But what I'm going to do is like a flash round that you would see in a presidential debate. So I'm going to start with Jeffrey, and we're going to go down to Alan. And what I'm going to ask them is if you had one thing that you could change as policy or administrative, king for a day sort of thing, what would that one thing be? And give me 30 seconds on that. Jeffrey?
I think my biggest thing would be, just for government to get out of the way and let the private sector innovate and come up with solutions for every single issue that comes across our city.
You stole mine.
Well, you have plenty of time to think of a new one.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. Could I steal that one? No, you have to have limitations on how government can grow, because without bounds, it'll just keep growing. So, doing some additional work on that rollback rate and getting it significantly lower, but also they find creative ways to raise other revenue, but rollback.
Yes. Michelle?
I agree with everything that's been said thus far, and I would say don't set policy in one-size-fits-all troughs. It doesn't work for anything.
Wait a minute, is that a one-size-fits-all solution? Okay.
Public-private innovation has got to be the key. We got to partner with government, but we have to take the lead. The marketplace has to take the lead.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you so much for attending today. It's really important to get urban policy right and to have some appreciation for what urban policy does to the culture at large. Our cities are more important than ever, and it's important for us as engaged citizens not to cede that ground, not to give up without a fight, not to just go away to the suburbs and the rural areas and only come into the cities when we need medical attention or to work. The cities are a vital part of what will happen in America's future, and we thank you so much for attending today. Have a safe drive home.